Story 1. This narrative unfolds from the initial period of my engagement in childcare services. My parents, unfortunately, struggled with substance addiction, which left me no alternative but to seek out part-time employment to accumulate funds before I could establish independent living. I was making my way home from a vehicle cleaning assignment that a friend had secured for me, having waited for nearly 30 minutes when my father failed to appear. I began my trek homeward, and as I walked, the thick woodlands lining both sides of the roadway cast an eerie atmosphere around me. I was on the verge of making a left turn when my gaze was drawn to a large arboreal structure, upon which something had become affixed. The object was secured to that tree, and the movement of the air caused it to tear. I approached it closely and discerned an announcement regarding a missing individual. This particular advertisement appeared delicate. Beneath it, I could perceive another sheet. I detached the missing person flyer and discovered a notice for a live-in caregiver. I was uncertain whether I should submit an application for the position, so I decided to take the pamphlet with me, intending to make a decision upon reaching my dwelling. When I arrived home, I observed smoke emanating from our kitchen window. I promptly hurried inside and found my mother lying on the kitchen floor in an unconscious state, and my father passed out on the sofa, thoroughly intoxicated. Both were fortunate that I returned home in a timely manner, otherwise our residence would have been consumed by fire, taking my parents with it. I successfully brought the situation under control and roused both of them. That occasion marked the first instance I ever raised my voice at them, exclaiming, "You individuals are unwell, you know what? Do not procreate if you cannot even maintain an upright posture." I then swiftly moved to my room and commenced packing my belongings. The following morning, I contacted the client, and fortunately, I secured the employment opportunity. I entered a taxi and embarked on a journey towards a new commencement. After proceeding along the main thoroughfare, the taxi operator executed a right turn, and we arrived near a dusty track leading into the arboreal expanse. When the automobile approached their colossal iron entrance, I finally comprehended the immense wealth these individuals possessed. It was not merely a house, it was a grand estate. I depressed the activation button on the gate, and a male voice emanated from the attached microphone, stating, "Please wait." A few additional seconds elapsed, and the iron gate glided open, producing a rough, metallic sound. An elderly gentleman of average stature, attired as a domestic servant, advanced towards me. He welcomed me to the Whistling Woods residence and invited me to accompany him. The man took my baggage and began to walk towards the dwelling. I followed him, simultaneously pondering the vastness of this estate. A magnificent marble fountain graced the center of the verdant, captivating garden area. Traversing the artistically designed pathway constructed from white pebbles, we reached the main entrance. The man manipulated the doorknob, and I stepped for the first time into this colossal abode. I observed a tall, attractive man, likely in his late 40s, positioned near the intricately carved wooden staircase, partaking in a cigar. He expelled plumes of smoke and uttered in a deep voice, "I am James Harshall. You must be Bethany. My wife has conversed with you previously." I responded, "Yes, thank you for having me, Mr. Harshall." Mr. Harshall smiled and instructed the housekeeper to escort Miss Bethany to her sleeping quarters. He then turned to me and stated, "Proceed with him and refresh yourself. We shall convene at luncheon." I nodded my head and silently trailed the aged man. The house was so utterly devoid of sound that I felt a sense of self-consciousness each time my footfalls generated a slight creaking noise on the wooden flooring. My assigned room was located on the lower level, to the left, opposite the living room. I had never previously encountered such a lavish sleeping chamber. The soft cushioning of the pillows and the immense size of the bed made me hesitant to even touch them, out of fear. The housekeeper deposited my bags near the table and announced, "Lunch is at 12:30. Please press the white switch if you require anything." After indulging in a soothing hot shower, when I entered the dining area, I noticed Mr. Harshall was already seated. The table was laden with various foodstuffs, and some of the culinary creations appeared to be beyond my customary experience. I took my seat, and he declared, "Here comes my wife and our son, Noah." I turned to perceive a delicate, petite woman entering the dining room accompanied by a peculiar doll. The doll was dressed in the fashion of a distinguished gentleman. I spoke in a hushed tone, "I do not perceive your son, Mr. Harshall." He cast an embarrassed glance my way, and Miss Harshall articulated in a high-pitched, loud voice, "Are you blind? Here is our son, Noah," as she positioned the doll on the chair directly across from me. I felt profoundly humiliated and simultaneously bewildered. I stammered, "Oh, I apologize, Miss Harshall, I failed to notice him." The entirety of the midday meal resembled a nightmare. Initially, I believed it might be a practical joke or some form of jest, but then I realized Miss Harshall was genuinely treating that figure as a living infant. She conversed and chuckled while attempting to feed the doll's soup. I could barely consume my own soup, and portions of food were dripping everywhere onto the doll, yet Miss Harshall did not even seem perturbed. Her conduct clearly indicated that she was mentally unsound. No one uttered a solitary utterance throughout the entire lunch, and I came to the realization that my decision to come here was a significant error. Following lunch, Miss Harshall led me to what she referred to as her son's room and presented me with a printed list. She stated, "Every day you must adhere to this regimen for Noah. If you neglect a single responsibility, he will become exceedingly upset, and the last thing you would desire is an angry Noah." My heart commenced to beat more rapidly as I could hardly believe my sight. This woman was utterly deranged. I accepted the list and proceeded towards my room. On the way, I encountered Mr. Harshall, who expressed remorse for his wife's demeanor and ultimately disclosed the grave affliction tormenting that woman. 2 years prior, Miss Harshall had given birth to a male infant whom they had named Noah. When the child reached the age of 1 year, he managed to crawl out of his crib and approached the staircase. Before anyone could intervene, the child stumbled, rolled down the sharply angled steps, and tragically perished. Since that time, Miss Harshall had lost her mental faculties and clutched Noah's cherished toy, adamantly asserting that her son remained alive. Mr. Harshall sighed heavily and remarked, "Believe me, Bethany, I detest participating in this lunacy, but I have already endured the loss of my son. I cannot bear to lose my wife as well." I felt sympathy for the married couple, and having no other alternatives, I resolved to participate in the pretense. I began attending to the doll as if it were Noah, meticulously following the instructions on the provided list. I roused him in the morning, bathed him, changed his attire, and even took him for promenades in his wheeled carriage. However, as time progressed, peculiar occurrences began to unfold. One evening, subsequent to dinner, I conveyed the doll to his room for his bedtime. The final obligation of the day involved crooning a lullaby to Noah, and the list explicitly stipulated that I must complete the entire lullaby prior to leaving him for the nocturnal hours. I maintained the pretense for nearly a week, but on the fifth night, I finally capitulated. I was exhausted from expending all my energy on caring for a mere doll and desired to retire early. Consequently, I softly sang a few lines of the lullaby and then rose to depart. In a burst of frustration, I tossed the doll into its sleeping cradle and extinguished the room's illumination. As I returned and reclined upon my bed, I could not help but ponder how much longer I would be capable of enduring this absurdity. Such thoughts occupied my mind as I drifted into slumber. I cannot recall the precise time, but I awoke to the sensation of small digits gently stroking my feet. As I unsealed my sleep-laden eyes, I perceived a dark silhouette perched on my bed in a crawling posture. I murmured in a groggy voice, "Please allow me to sleep, Noah," and turned onto my other side. It was precisely then that the figure emitted a very chilling giggle, and I sprang upright on the bed. I activated the bedside lamp and found myself utterly alone in my room. What in the world did I just witness? I wondered. I rose from the bed, drenched in perspiration, and proceeded to the lavatory to splash water on my visage. With the initial application of water, I heard Miss Harshall's voice from outside and peered from the bathroom window. Miss Harshall was running into the wooded area, shrieking, "No, baby, no, come back to mommy." I immediately rushed outdoors, assuming she was experiencing a mental breakdown. I observed her heading towards the left portion of the garden, so I ran in the same direction. Her crimson nightgown flickered in the darkness, and without a moment's hesitation, I followed her into the woods. It was the dead of night. After a certain distance, I somehow lost sight of her in the obscureness. I stood there, utterly bewildered, wandering within those woods. There was no one else in my vicinity. The distinctive call of owls intermingled with the howling of coyotes, creating a sensation as though I had inadvertently stepped into a realm where I did not belong. I turned around and found myself face to face with Miss Harshall. She stood like a frenzied individual, with bloodshot eyes intently gazing directly into my very essence. Gripping me by my shoulders, she shrieked at me, "What did you do? What did you do to make him furious? I instructed you to adhere to the list. Why did you not obey me?" She then pivoted towards the dark woods and cried out in agony, "Noah, my darling, return to mommy. Mommy will take excellent care of you." I attempted to interject, "Miss Harshall, please control yourself. Your son is not alive, you must accept this. Please cease this madness." She retorted, "What are you saying? Can you not hear his lamentation? Listen." I was about to articulate how profoundly disturbing this entire situation was, but my lips instantly sealed. Behind me, the distinct cry of a baby emerged. The entire area seemed to vibrate with that angry, yet sorrowful, sobbing. The reverberation of the cry caused my head to throb with pain, and my heart nearly burst with terror, yet I remained unable to move. I stood motionless as the deranged wail intensified progressively. Miss Harshall guffawed uncontrollably upon observing my petrified expression. "Look! Now she believes you are alive. Are you content now? Observe what you have inflicted upon my son, you have caused him to weep. I spun around and perceived a child standing some distance away from me, clutching that very doll. The child possessed no eyes, profound darkness streamed from its vacant ocular cavities, and black liquid was ejected from its mouth as it distended its jaw to an almost impossibly wide extent, nearly reaching its chest. I shrieked at the highest volume my lungs could produce and collapsed onto the ground in a state of unconsciousness. The domestic staff discovered me insensible within the woods the subsequent morning. I was afflicted with a high fever, and Mr. Harshall contacted my father via telephone. My parents arrived and retrieved me from their dwelling. I remained silent and did not venture outside for an entire month. I never discussed what had transpired there with my parents, nor did they ever initiate a conversation about any of it. I presume they were simply relieved to have found their daughter alive. To this very day, I frequently awaken, hearing that furious wail of a child, accompanied by Miss Harshall's voice, "Noah, baby, come to mommy. I will sing you a lullaby." Story 2. Before commencing the subsequent anecdote, I wish to extend an invitation for you all to subscribe to my channel if you have not yet done so, and if you are already subscribers, then you are truly exceptional. I never held a fondness for my childcare provider during my formative years. It wasn't that I harbored animosity towards her, however, her designation was Sarah. She rarely engaged in much activity beyond lounging on my living room sofa, consuming my provisions while my parents were absent. I used to entertain the notion that being a young adult must have been effortless if one could receive remuneration for idleness, much like her. The final occasion she ever supervised me was when I was approximately 11 years of age. Tim, my younger male sibling, was 8 years old at that particular juncture, while my elder brother, Thomas, was 13. Thomas had continuously advocated to my parents, ever since he formally attained adolescence, that they ought to permit him to assume responsibility for me and Tim instead of engaging Sarah for childcare. It subsequently became evident that my parents truly should have heeded his advice. My parents were preparing to depart for their customary monthly outing and summoned Sarah to oversee us, precisely as they had done on countless preceding instances. And just as on those numerous previous occasions, Sarah instantly settled onto the divan and commenced interacting with her mobile device the very instant my parents had departed. She only dismounted from the sofa when it was time to provide us with sustenance. She warmed some leftover provisions in the microwave, and we all engaged in conversation at the dining table during our evening meal. Or rather, my brothers and I conversed amongst ourselves while Sarah diligently messaged someone on her telephone, paying absolutely no heed to us. I surmised it must have been her male companion. The few instances I had overheard her conversing on the telephone rather than texting, she employed terms of endearment such as babe or lover boy while producing kissing sounds into the handset. Repulsive, I am aware. Nevertheless, I did discern something peculiar about her that specific night. She was not quite as distracted as she typically was. Every so often, she would actually lift her gaze from her phone to peer out one of the windows, almost as though she were attempting to keep watch over us, as she was expected to do. Once the evening meal concluded, she promptly returned to the couch with her phone, while Thomas and I were left to undertake the chore of washing the dishes. Have you observed anything unusual about Sarah? I inquired of Thomas as we were cleansing and drying the plates and utensils from which we had consumed our meal. He responded, "Not really, why?" I elaborated, "Well, she persistently looks up from her phone and glances at the doors and windows. It's as if she's genuinely concerned about us, which is odd, considering it's Sarah." Thomas emitted a soft chuckle. "The residence could be ablaze, and she wouldn't bother to extinguish it. I am certain it's nothing." "Yeah, you're probably correct," I conceded. I dismissed the notion from my mind and concentrated on completing the remaining unwashed dishes. However, I found myself unable to cease contemplating it, long after Sarah had dispatched the three of us to our sleeping quarters. I lay awake, deliberating on what could possibly have compelled the perpetually indifferent Sarah to show any semblance of concern for us. I was on the verge of entirely forgetting about it when I heard the distinct sound of glass shattering from the lower floor. The sound roused my younger brother, and I immediately exited my bed. "What was that?" Tim asked, as he rubbed his eyes, still half asleep. "I don't know," I responded, "but I intend to investigate." "You simply remain precisely where you are." I cautiously eased open our bedroom door and tiptoed past Thomas's room, then past the staircase, my heart pounding vigorously within my chest. I was barely able to take 2 steps when I abruptly froze in my tracks at the sight that met my eyes through the banister. A male figure stood in the center of the living room, with a brown fabric sack slung over his shoulder. He wore no facial covering and moved about as though he possessed the premises, rummaging through the drawers and cupboards, endeavoring to locate anything of monetary worth. Lying on the floor was one of my parents' decorative vessels, fragmented into a myriad of pieces. I surmised he must have fractured it while attempting to force it into his bag, which had caused the noise that awakened us. Unsure of what course of action to take, I hastened to Thomas's room and pushed open the door. He was lying awake on his bed but had his audio output devices affixed, so he must not have detected the sound of the vase breaking downstairs. He appeared startled upon seeing me and removed his headphones. "Hey, are you all right, little bro?" he inquired. "There's someone in the house," I blurted out in a state of terror. A grave expression settled across Thomas's countenance, and he instantly retrieved a baseball bat from beside his bed. "Go be with Tim and contact the authorities, but no equivocations. I will handle this." I could only presume he was endeavoring to demonstrate to himself and our parents his capability to protect both me and my younger brother. Nevertheless, I could not bear to abandon him to confront our unwelcome intruder alone. I dispatched a text message to the police and positioned myself to observe from the stair railings as Thomas advanced to engage the burglar. The burglar was in the midst of emptying a strongbox when Thomas lunged at him, his baseball bat raised high into the air. The intruder did not even have the opportunity to react before Thomas struck his cranium with the bat. A sense of relief washed over me as I watched the man collapse onto the floor, blood profusely flowing from the contused side of his head. However, Thomas did not cease his assault there. He continued to pummel the burglar, bringing his bat down repeatedly on his head, his chest, anywhere he could make contact. I was unable to determine if it was righteous indignation or a surge of fearful adrenaline fueling his forceful swings, but his actions were beginning to frighten me more than the burglar lying crumpled on the floor. "Thomas, that is sufficient," I cried out, tears welling in my eyes. Thomas halted his baseball bat mid-swing. Had he followed through with that particular strike, I was convinced that the convulsing burglar on the floor would have expired. I observed Thomas take a deep breath, which appeared to calm him. He turned to me, articulating something, likely a reprimand for not adhering to his instructions, yet all I could distinguish emanating from him was a faint gurgling sound as a bladed implement penetrated his throat from behind and emerged through the anterior aspect of his neck. Behind him, clutching the knife, was Sarah. Her mouth was twisted into a vicious snarl, and her eyes were ablaze with fury. She extracted the knife, and a fountain of blood spurted from the aperture in Thomas's neck. He fell to his knees and clutched his gaping throat, struggling desperately to inhale through the blood that had inundated his pulmonary organs. She did not even grant him a chance. She brought her knife down upon him repeatedly, screaming vulgarities as she did so, referring to him as a brute for harming her male companion. I instantly comprehended the unfolding events and sprinted back into my room. I secured the door and cowered beneath the bed with Tim until the law enforcement personnel arrived in response to my textual message. Sarah and her male companion were both apprehended and taken into custody. Thomas was removed from the scene in a containment bag. Sarah was never genuinely concerned for our well-being. I was foolish to entertain such a thought. She merely wished to ascertain that none of the neighboring residents were still awake so that no one would witness her boyfriend once she allowed him entry into the dwelling to perpetrate the robbery. To this day, I have not absolved my parents for engaging an individual like Sarah to supervise us, and truthfully, I do not believe they will ever forgive themselves either. Story 3. I undertook childcare duties during my collegiate years to accrue additional monetary resources. The alternatives were either that or a part-time position at a fast food establishment like Speedy Bites, and babysitting offered me a more adaptable timetable. Being the eldest among 4 siblings, I possessed a commendable aptitude with children as well, so it seemed to align perfectly with my capabilities. In any case, while I largely savored my period working as a childcare provider, there was one particular assignment that irrevocably tainted the experience for me. The client consisted of a prosperous couple residing within my local vicinity. They had observed my advertisement in the community newspaper and contacted me one afternoon as I was leisurely occupying my room, engrossed in electronic gaming. "Hello, is this Joan?" inquired the female parent from the opposite end of the communication line. "I require someone to oversee my child. Are you available this coming Friday, by any chance?" "Yes, I am free," I replied, rising from my bed to concentrate on the discourse. "How many children do you require me to supervise?" "Just one." She paused for a moment before continuing, "Well, 2, but you do not need to concern yourself with the other one." "Could you please elaborate on that?" I requested. "Well, one of my sons is 10 years old. He is the one I need you to look after," she elucidated. "The other one is 17, but I genuinely do not trust him to care for his brother. He's special." From my previous experiences, the term "special" is typically a parental euphemism for some form of disability, be it mental or otherwise. However, I did not object. It simply implied that I would need to exhibit a slightly greater degree of attentiveness than usual. Nevertheless, I desired to be fully informed of the situation beforehand. "That is perfectly acceptable, ma'am. Is there anything specific I should be aware of concerning him, though?" You do not have to be overly concerned about him. He typically keeps to himself within his room. Just leave a dish of food in front of his room at approximately 6 o'clock, and he will be content." We continued our conversation for a short while, and I consented to spend the night, as she and her husband would be away on an overnight excursion. Once we had agreed upon the compensation, I resumed playing video games without a second thought, completely unaware of the enormous error I had just committed. When Friday arrived, I proceeded to the address the mother had supplied me over the telephone. I rapped on the door, and moments later, I was greeted by a benevolent-looking pair who introduced me to their youthful son. His name was Danny, and he appeared sufficiently well-behaved, if a little reticent. They then directed me towards the room of their reclusive adolescent son, whose name I subsequently learned was Ryan. Apparently, Ryan resided in their subterranean level, a tad unconventional, but I chose not to interrogate the matter. I merely assumed he must have appreciated the absence of commotion in the basement. Once they had established the fundamental guidelines, I bid farewell to the parents and endeavored to interact with Danny to the best of my ability. He did not facilitate ease of interaction, though. He scarcely ever made direct visual contact with me, and whenever he did, I could perceive a peculiar melancholy in his gaze. I am nothing if not tenacious, however, and eventually, I managed to encourage him to confide in me incrementally, by discussing his preferred televised programs while he created fan art of them in the living room with colored drawing implements. I have viewed such an extensive amount of SpongeBob SquarePants and Sesame Street during my tenure caring for young children that my comprehension of them was nearly exhaustive. Connecting with quieter children, like Danny, becomes significantly simpler when I am capable of understanding their pastimes and fascinations. When the hour for the evening meal arrived, I resolved to procure some pepperoni pizza for both of us, much to Danny's immense delight. When the pizza delivery arrived, I compensated the delivery person with some monetary funds the parents had entrusted to me for takeout provisions and carried it inside before we commenced eating. I placed 2 slices of the pizza onto a clean plate and poured an effervescent, chilled beverage for Ryan. I positioned the plate and glass in front of Ryan's room and tapped on the door. "Ryan," I called out, "I am leaving your dinner outside your door, in case you wish to consume it. It is pizza, so you should partake of it while it is still warm." I detected a thumping sound of movement originating from behind the door, indicating that Ryan must have heard me. However, I did not linger to observe him open the door. If the reason he confined himself to his room was due to some undiagnosed anxiety disorder, I did not wish to inadvertently provoke a panic attack by my presence. Individuals who spend the entirety of their day within their room, as he does, probably harbor an aversion to encountering new people anyway. As I was moving away from the door, I heard it open and then shut behind me. Content that Ryan had accessed his food, I returned to spending time with Danny while devouring the remainder of the pizza. We were laughing and jesting about his favorite episode of SpongeBob, when an expression of apprehension suddenly crossed his face. "Hey, are you all right, Danny?" I inquired. He directed his gaze towards me, and I could discern that his eyes were glistening with a profound sorrow, the origin of which I could not decipher. "You are going to remain with me tonight, correct?" he asked. "You are not going to depart anywhere, are you?" I was slightly taken aback by his inquiry and dismissed it as him excessively deliberating, as he had no cause to. "Of course, I will be here," I reassured him. Promise. And if you are ever concerned about anything, simply approach me. I will be situated right on the couch until your parents return home. All right?" His facial expression brightened, and we quickly reverted to discussing animated programs once more. That night, I slept on the sofa with my mobile communication device in my pocket, in the event the parents attempted to reach me. Everything appeared to be normal until, from out of nowhere, I was forcibly pulled from my slumber by a firm hand covering my mouth and nasal passages. I attempted to vocalize a scream, but no sound escaped. I struggled desperately to inhale, but it was impossible through the unseen assailant's powerful grip. An arm encircled my throat, rendering breathing even more arduous, and I could feel myself being elevated from the couch. I was dragged away from the living room, flailing my legs and clawing at my attacker's arm in my desperate attempts to breathe. I felt my fingernails embedding themselves into flesh, but whoever the individual was did not exhibit any indications of ceasing. I managed to catch a fleeting glimpse of the basement door opening before I was forcefully propelled inside. I tumbled down the staircase and landed on the unyielding wooden floor, impacting my shoulder. I coughed and gasped for air in an effort to regain my composure. When I finally lifted my gaze from the floor, I beheld what I can only depict as a sleeping chamber from Hades. Every single piece of furnishing appeared as though it had been fashioned from osseous material or tanned animal hide. And not just any bone either. The leg of the nightstand seemed to be constructed from a human spinal column and other bones. The covering of tanned hide on the bedside lamp featured a human countenance protruding from it. Even the seating cushion of the sofa looked as if it had been meticulously sewn together from the dermal layers of a dozen distinct individuals. The space resembled more of a deranged fabrication workshop than a dwelling suitable for any mentally sound person. Blood-stained implements, which must have been utilized to craft the twisted furniture, hung upon the walls. I rotated to peer up the stairs and observed a filthy teenage boy with thin, black hair and garments stained with blood, grinning at me with decaying green and yellow dentition. His deranged, bloodshot eyes were fixed upon me as he descended the stairs. "Such beautiful skin," he murmured. He seized a rusty hammering tool from his collection on the wall without diminishing his advance. I cannot wait to recline within it. I finally recovered my voice sufficiently to emit a hoarse shriek. Not a second later, he re-gripped me by the throat with one hand. "Do not be apprehensive," he whispered into my ear, his foul, moist breath nearly causing me to vomit into my throat. "I will transform you into something exquisite." He elevated his hammering tool, poised to strike. I sealed my eyes and offered a silent plea that my demise would be swift, but the impact never materialized. Instead, I felt his grasp relinquish my neck, followed by a shrill scream that was not my own. I opened my eyes and perceived Danny standing behind the adolescent, clutching the very same color drawing implement he had been utilizing that day. Half of it was embedded into the teenager's shoulder, eliciting a cry of pain from him. Seizing an opportunity for escape, I delivered a forceful kick to my teenage attacker's groin area. While he was bent over in pain on the ground, I seized Danny's hand and fled from the dwelling as rapidly as possible. Once we were both securely inside a neighbor's residence, I contacted the law enforcement authorities, who arrived within mere minutes. They apprehended the teenage boy, who was identified as Ryan, Danny's introverted elder sibling. They then conducted a thorough search of his entire subterranean bedroom. They confirmed what I had witnessed and verified what I had desperately wished not to believe. Inside his room were scores of furnishings fabricated from human bone and leather. Some of the leather was subsequently traced back to grave desecration incidents within the locality, while other portions were far too recently acquired to have been excised from a cadaver. Beneath his bed, they discovered a coverlet constructed entirely from human faces. It was lacking one final section in the corner. Had it not been for Danny's timely intervention, my own visage would have been appended to it. The most recent information I received was that Ryan had been committed to a mental health facility where, hopefully, he will remain for a considerably lengthy duration.